The neon sign of the Broken Spoke Saloon flickered against the twilight, a red and jagged heartbeat in the humid Austin air, signaling to every weary soul that inside these wooden walls, time moved a little slower, and the beer was always cold enough to numb the sting of a hard day. The dust on the floorboards of the spoke had been settled and kicked up by 3 generations of boots, creating a fine, hazy atmosphere that smelled of sawdust, old tobacco, and the sweet, lingering scent of floor wax. It was a Thursday, usually a quiet night, but the air held a peculiar weight, the kind of barometric pressure that warns of a coming storm. Not just in the sky, but in the soul. In the back corner, away from the scuffed dance floor where a young couple swayed clumsily to a jukebox ballad, sat a man who looked like he was carved out of the very landscape of Texas itself. He wore a starch-pressed Wrangler shirt, the color of a faded denim sky, and a black cowboy hat that was pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, but not enough to hide the kindness etched into the crow's feet around them. He nursed a glass of iced tea, the condensation weeping down the sides and pooling on the scarred wooden table. To the few tourists who wandered in, he was just another local cowboy taking a load off. To the regulars, he was a fixture, a part of the furniture. But to anyone who truly knew the heart of country music, the man sitting in the shadows was George Strait, the king himself, seeking a moment of silence in the only place that still felt like the Texas of his youth. George was tired, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with touring or the physical toll of the road, but rather the spiritual exhaustion of a world that was spinning too fast, losing its reverence for the things that mattered. He watched the dust motes dance in the beam of a singular spotlight near the stage, his mind drifting away from the honky-tonk and towards the coast. The weather reports had been talking about a massive system pushing in from the Gulf, a wall of rain and wind that was battering Galveston. Most people would head inland, away from the fury of the ocean. George felt a pull in the opposite direction. He felt a calling to the water, to the gray horizon, and specifically to a place that held more ghosts than guests. He finished his tea, the ice clinking softly against the glass, a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden lull of conversation. He placed a $20 bill on the table, tipped his hat to the bartender who offered a silent, respectful nod in return, and walked out into the humid night. The door of the Broken Spoke swung shut behind him, cutting off the music, leaving him in the quiet hum of the parking lot. He climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life with a reliable rumble, and turned his headlights south. He was going to the Hotel Galvez. The drive to Galveston was a journey through a curtain of water that grew heavier with every mile marker that passed in the blur of the headlights. By the time George crossed the causeway, the rain was no longer falling. It was being driven sideways by a wind that howled like a wounded animal. The Gulf of Mexico was a churning cauldron of black ink and white foam, crashing against the seawall with a violence that shook the ground. The Hotel Galvez rose from the darkness like a fortress, its pink stucco walls turned gray in the storm, its Spanish tile roof slick and shining. It was a place of history, a grand old dame that had survived hurricanes, fires, and the slow erosion of decades. George parked his truck, grabbing his guitar case from the back seat, not because he planned to play for anyone, but because the instrument was an extension of his body, a limb he couldn't leave behind. He ran through the deluge, the rain soaking through his jacket in seconds, and pushed through the revolving brass doors into the lobby. The silence inside was sudden and absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. The lobby of the Galvez was dimly lit, the chandeliers casting long, intricate shadows across the marble floors and the potted palms that swayed slightly from the drafts leaking through the old windows. The air smelled of sea salt, old paper, and lavender polish. The night clerk was a young man, barely out of his 20s, who looked up with wide eyes as the legend shook the rain from his hat. He didn't say a word, just fumbled for the registration card, his hands trembling slightly. George smiled, that easy, crooked smile that had disarmed millions over the years, and signed the paper with a steady hand. He didn't ask for a suite or a view. He just asked for a room on the 3rd floor, the quiet side. The clerk handed him a heavy brass key, the metal cold against George's palm. The elevator ride was slow, the mechanical gears groaning as they lifted him upward. When the doors slid open on the 3rd floor, the hallway stretched out before him, an endless tunnel of patterned carpet and cream-colored walls, punctuated by dark wood doors. It was empty. The storm outside was just a muffled drumming against the thick walls now. George walked slowly, his boots making no sound on the plush carpet. He was looking for room 312, his assigned sanctuary. He adjusted the grip on his guitar case, his mind wandering to Norma. She was back at the ranch, safe and warm. They had spoken earlier, her voice the anchor that kept him tethered to the earth. But as he walked, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of displacement, as if the timeline of his life had skipped a beat. He was passing room 300, then 302, then 304. The hallway seemed to darken slightly, the electric sconces flickering with the instability of the power grid fighting the storm. And then he saw it. Ahead of him, about 20 feet away, the door to room 305 stood out. It wasn't just a door. It looked heavier, older, the wood grain deeper and darker than the others. But what stopped George dead in his tracks wasn't the door itself. It was the light. A soft golden glow was spilling from underneath it, not the harsh white of a modern bulb, but the warm, flickering luminescence of a vintage lamp, or perhaps candlelight. And then the door opened. It didn't creak. It swung inward with a smooth, silent motion. George blinked, sure that his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. A figure stepped into the frame of the open door, moving from the hallway into the room. It was a woman. She was turned away from him, but George felt the breath leave his lungs as if he had been kicked in the chest by a bronco. The woman was wearing a blue dress, a specific shade of cornflower blue with white lace trim around the collar. It was a sundress, the kind that was popular in the early 80s. He knew that dress. He knew the way the fabric draped over her shoulders. He knew the way her hair was pinned up with a simple tortoiseshell clip, leaving a few loose strands to fall against her neck. "Norma?" he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips. The woman didn't turn. She glided into the room with a grace that belonged to a memory, her movement fluid and ethereal. She was carrying a small wicker beach bag, the same one Norma had carried on their trip to the coast in the summer of 1982, the year before everything exploded, the year before the radio hits and the tour buses changed the landscape of their lives forever. That summer had been their last taste of true anonymity, a week of sunburns and cheap shrimp dinners and laughter that echoed without interruption. George dropped his guitar case. The thud was muffled by the carpet, but to him it sounded like a gunshot. He ran. He didn't walk, he sprinted the 20 feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the door of room 305 just as it clicked shut. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the brass knob and twisted. It wouldn't budge. "Norma!" he shouted, pounding on the wood with the flat of his hand. "Norma, open the door! It's me!" The wood felt cold, unnaturally so. It didn't feel like interior wood. It felt like timber that had been soaked in the ocean and left to dry in a freezer. He twisted the knob again, using both hands, putting his shoulder into it. It was solid as a rock. He pressed his ear against the panel, desperate for a sound, a footstep, a voice. Silence. "Sir? Mr. Straight?" The voice came from behind him, trembling and filled with a unique brand of terror. George spun around, his back pressed against door 305, his chest heaving. The night manager, a different man from the clerk downstairs, stood at the end of the hallway near the elevators. He was an older man, balding, with skin the color of parchment paper. He held a heavy ring of keys in his hand. But he wasn't making a move to come closer. He looked at George, and then he looked at the door behind George, and his eyes widened with genuine fear. "You need to step away from there, Mr. Straight," the manager said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife," George said, pointing at the door. "I just saw my wife walk in there. She's wearing a dress from 40 years ago. Open it. I need you to open this door right now." The manager took a hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Straight, please, listen to me. That is impossible." "Don't tell me what's impossible," George snapped, the fear turning into frustration. "I saw her. I have 20/20 vision. She walked in, the light was on, and she shut the door. Just give me the key." The manager stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the door with a mixture of reverence and dread. "There is no key, sir. Not anymore." George looked at him, confusion clouding his anger. "What do you mean?" "Look at the lock, Mr. Straight. Look closely." George turned back to the door. In his panic, he hadn't examined the mechanism. He bent down, squinting in the dim light of the hallway sconces. The keyhole wasn't open. It was filled. A dull gray metal had been poured into the mechanism, sealing it completely. It wasn't a fresh job. The metal was oxidized, scratched, and old. He ran his thumb over it. Lead. The lock had been fused with molten lead. "Room 305 has been sealed for 10 years, the manager explained, his voice gaining a little strength now that George wasn't pounding on the wood. "After the flood of 2013, the structural damage to this specific suite was deemed irreparable. The floor joists were compromised. The hotel ownership decided it was too expensive to gut it and too dangerous to let anyone inside. They sealed it, welded the hinges from the inside before they closed it, and poured lead into the lock. No one has set foot in that room in a decade. The housekeeping staff doesn't even clean the doorknob." George straightened up, staring at the lead plug. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the physical reality before him with the visual truth he had just witnessed. He was George Straight. He was a man of the land, a man of cattle and horses and ropes. He dealt in tangible things. If a fence was broken, you fixed it. If a guitar string snapped, you replaced it. He didn't deal in hallucinations. "I know what I saw," George said, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who would not be moved. "I saw a woman in a blue dress. I saw a light, a golden light." The manager paled even further. "The light," he muttered. "Others have said, but never a guest. Only the old maids. They talk about the light." "Open it," George commanded. "Get a crowbar, get a sledgehammer. I'll pay for the door. I'll pay for the whole damn wing of the hotel if I have to, but I am going into that room." "I can't do that, sir," the manager said, backing away. "If we breach that door, the structural integrity of the floor could give way. It's a liability. I could lose my job. The hotel could be shut down. Please, Mr. Straight, you're tired. The storm, the low pressure, it plays tricks on the mind. The Galvez is old. She makes people see things they want to see." George looked at the manager, seeing the genuine terror in the man's eyes. He wasn't going to get help from him, not tonight. He looked back at the door. The wood seemed to vibrate slightly against his fingertips. "Fine," George said. "Leave me." "Sir, your room is 312. It's down the hall. It's comfortable, dry." "I'm not going to 312, George said, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the carpet, his back resting against the doorframe of room 305. He pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them. "I'm staying right here." "Mr. Straight, you can't sit in the hallway all night." "Watch me," George said. He tipped his hat down, obscuring his eyes. "Go back to the desk. If I need anything, I'll holler." The manager hesitated for a long moment, clearly torn between enforcing hotel policy and respecting the wishes of a living legend. Finally, the weight of George's celebrity and the eerie atmosphere of the hallway won out. I'll send up a pot of coffee, sir," the manager whispered, and then retreated quickly to the elevator. His footsteps hurried, as if he expected the door to burst open behind him. George was alone. The hallway was quiet again, save for the distant, muffled roar of the storm outside. He closed his eyes, trying to replay the moment. The blue dress, the specific lace. Norma had worn that dress to dinner at a small seafood shack on the pier. He remembered she had spilled a drop of cocktail sauce on the hem and had been so worried about the stain. He remembered laughing, telling her it didn't matter, that she was the most beautiful thing in Texas. He remembered the way she looked at him, with a love so pure it felt like sunlight. That was 1982. They were young parents then. Bubba was just a baby. The world was big and scary and full of promise. Why that moment? Why here? Why now? He shifted on the floor, the carpet rough against his jeans. He wasn't crazy. He knew he wasn't. He had spent 40 years in an industry designed to drive men mad, and he had kept his boots firmly on the ground. He didn't do drugs. He didn't drink to excess. He was a man of routine and discipline. What he had seen was real. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, like the buzzing of a fly, but it grew clearer as he focused his attention. It was coming from inside the room. It was a voice, a woman's voice. She was humming. George held his breath. He leaned his head back until his ear was pressed flat against the cold wood of the door. The humming was melodic, soft, intimate. It wasn't a ghostly moan. It was the sound of someone content. Someone absent-mindedly singing to themselves while they unpacked a suitcase or brushed their hair. He recognized the melody instantly. It hit him harder than the sight of the dress. It was "I Cross My Heart." But it wasn't the version the world knew. It wasn't the polished, studio-produced track that had been played at a million weddings. It was the acoustic version. The version he had written and played for Norma on the front porch of the ranch before he ever took it to the studio. The version that had a slightly different tempo, a hesitation in the chorus that he had ironed out later. Only 2 people in the world knew that specific cadence, him and Norma. "Norma," he whispered into the wood. "Baby, can you hear me?" The humming didn't stop. It didn't acknowledge him. It just continued, a loop of melody trapped in the air. George felt a tear slide down his cheek, hot and sudden. The rational part of his brain was screaming that this was a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the atmospheric pressure. The emotional part of his brain, the part that wrote the songs, knew better. The room wasn't just a space. It was a container, a vault. Somehow, the intensity of that summer in 1982, the sheer volume of love and peace they had felt in this hotel, had imprinted itself onto the walls. The storm outside, the energy in the air, maybe it had unlocked it. Maybe the past wasn't gone. Maybe it was just stored away, like old furniture in an attic, waiting for the right light to reveal it. He sat there for hours. The coffee came and went, brought by a terrified bellboy who set the tray down 10 feet away and ran. George drank the black liquid, staring at the pattern on the carpet, listening to the humming. Sometimes it would stop, and he would hear the rustle of fabric or the sound of a window sash being raised. Sounds that were impossible in a sealed room with fused locks. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. The building groaned. The lights in the hallway flickered and died, leaving George in darkness, save for the emergency exit sign at the end of the hall, which cast a bloody red glow over the scene. In the darkness, the line between sanity and madness began to blur. George started to talk to the door. He told it about the years since 1982. He spoke about the awards, the stadiums, the cheering crowds that sounded like thunder. He spoke about the loss of his daughter, a pain that never truly healed, a scar on his heart that he carried through every song. He spoke about the quiet moments at the ranch, the way the sun hit the hay in the morning. He poured his life out to the wood and the lead seal, confessing the loneliness that comes with being an icon, the isolation of being a legend. "I miss the simple days," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I miss when it was just us, Norma. Before the world owned a piece of me, I'd give it all back. Every gold record, every dollar, just to be back in that room with you, watching the rain, with nothing to do and nowhere to be." He waited. The humming had stopped. The silence was heavy, pregnant with expectation. George closed his eyes, his head resting against the doorframe. He was drifting, hovering on the edge of sleep, his body exhausted but his spirit alert. He didn't know what time it was. It felt like 3 a.m., the witching hour, the time when the veil between worlds is thinnest. He was just about to succumb to the darkness of sleep when he heard a sound that snapped his eyes open. It wasn't a hum, it was a physical sound. Scrape. It came from the bottom of the door. George sat up, his heart pounding again. He looked down at the gap between the door and the carpet. It was a tight fit, barely a quarter of an inch. The hallway was dark, but the emergency light cast enough of a glow for him to see something moving. Something white was sliding out from under the door. It moved slowly, with jerky, hesitant motions, as if being pushed by a finger on the other side. It wasn't dust, it was paper, a small, square piece of stiff paper. George held his breath, terrified to move, terrified to break the spell. The object slid fully out into the hallway and came to a rest against the toe of his boot. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. The texture was glossy on one side, matte on the other. He tilted it toward the red light of the exit sign. It was a Polaroid photograph. The chemicals were old, the colors slightly shifted toward magenta, but the image was clear. It was a picture of a hotel room, room 305. The bed was unmade. Sitting on the edge of the bed, laughing, with a towel wrapped around his head and a guitar in his lap, was a young George Strait. He looked barely 30, and in the mirror behind him, taking the photo, was Norma. She was wearing the blue dress. George flipped the photo over. On the back, written in black marker, in Norma's distinctive, looping handwriting, was a date, July 14, 1982. But the ink wasn't faded. It wasn't brown with age. The black marker was fresh. It glistened wetly in the red light. And as George watched, he saw a smudge on the corner where his own thumb had just touched it. The ink was wet. A photograph from 40 years ago with wet ink had just been pushed under a door that had been sealed with lead for a decade. George stared at the photo, his world tilting on its axis. This was no longer a trick of the mind. This was physical proof. The room wasn't just a memory, it was alive, and it was reaching out to him. He stood up, his knees cracking, clutching the photo to his chest. The skepticism was gone. The fear was gone, replaced by a singular, burning purpose. He looked at the sealed door, not as a barrier, but as a puzzle. "Okay," George whispered to the door, his voice filled with a new, steel-like resolve. "You're trying to tell me something. I'm listening." He didn't bang on the door this time. He didn't shout. He turned and walked down the hall to where he had left his guitar case. He picked it up, the weight familiar and grounding. He walked back to room 305 and sat down on the floor, crossing his legs. He unlatched the case, the sound of the snaps echoing like gunshots in the quiet hall. He lifted out his guitar, the acoustic Gibson he had played for 30 years. He tuned it quietly, his ear bent low to the strings. "If you're in there," George said to the wood, "and if this is 1982, then you're waiting for the song. You're waiting for me to finish it." He placed his fingers on the fretboard. He didn't play a concert chord. He played the opening chord of the acoustic version, the one he wrote on the porch, the one that lived in the memory of the room. He took a deep breath, and he began to play. The G chord rang out in the desolate hallway, a lonely, resonant vibration that seemed to hang in the air long after George's fingers had stilled the strings. It was the sound of a question being asked to the universe. He adjusted his grip on the neck of the guitar, the familiar satin finish of the mahogany warming under his palm. He wasn't playing for an audience of thousands this time. There were no spotlights blinding him, no screaming fans in the front row, no roadies scrambling in the wings. There was just the damp carpet, the flickering emergency light casting long, blood-red shadows, and a door that defied the laws of physics. George took a breath, inhaling the stale air of the hotel corridor, but in his mind he was breathing in the salt air of 1982. He closed his eyes, shutting out the peeling wallpaper and the lead-sealed lock, and focused entirely on the melody living inside his chest. He began to fingerpick the intro, the notes cascading over one another like small waves lapping against a shore. It was a gentle, rolling rhythm, stripped of the studio gloss, raw and vulnerable. He began to sing. His voice was lower now than it had been 40 years ago, roughened by time and smoke and the sheer mileage of a life lived on the road. But the pitch was perfect, and the emotion was infinitely deeper. "Our love is unconditional. We knew it from the start." The words left his lips and seemed to be absorbed by the wood of door 305. He wasn't singing to the door. He was singing through it. He was projecting his soul into the grain of the timber. As he played, the atmosphere in the hallway began to shift. The oppressive humidity that had leaked in from the storm outside started to recede, replaced by a dry, cool stillness. The howling of the wind against the hotel's exterior walls, which had been a constant roaring backdrop, faded into a distant, rhythmic hush, like the sound of the ocean on a calm night. "I see it in your eyes. You can feel it from my heart." George watched the door as he played. At first, nothing happened. The lead plug in the lock remained dull and gray. The wood looked as solid and impenetrable as a coffin lid. But George didn't falter. He leaned into the bridge of the song, his boots tapping a slow, steady rhythm on the carpet. He poured the memory of that summer into the music. He remembered the way the sun had looked hitting the water that July. He remembered the taste of the cheap wine they had bought at the corner store. He remembered the feeling of Norma's head on his shoulder as they watched the sunset. He channeled all of it into the vibration of the strings. "From here on after, let's stay the way we are." And then he saw it. The lead in the keyhole didn't melt. It didn't vanish. It simply ceased to be lead. The gray metal began to shimmer, turning translucent, then liquid, then evaporating into a fine mist that swirled for a second before dissipating into the air. The heavy, oxidized padlock that had been fused to the frame groaned. A sound like a ship stretching its timbers, and the metal brightened, the rust falling away in flakes to reveal polished, gleaming brass. George didn't stop playing. He knew, with an instinct that went beyond logic, that the music was the current powering this connection. If he stopped, the door would seal again. He stood up, the guitar strap digging into his shoulder, his fingers never missing a note. He stepped closer, the toe of his boot just inches from the threshold. I cross my heart and promise. The doorknob turned. It moved slowly, deliberately from the inside. It wasn't a ghostly rattle. It was the firm, confident turn of a human hand. The latch clicked, a crisp, mechanical sound that echoed with pristine clarity. The door swung inward, pulling a draft of air with it. The air that hit George's face wasn't the stale air of a hotel hallway. It smelled of coconut suntan oil. It smelled of fresh linens dried on a clothesline. It smelled of a woman's perfume, a specific floral scent that Norma hadn't worn since the late 80s because they stopped making it. George stopped singing. He let the final chord sustain, fading slowly into the silence. He lowered the guitar, holding it by the neck like a shield, and took a step forward. He crossed the threshold. The transition was physical. It felt like walking through a curtain of static electricity, a tingling sensation that started at his scalp and washed down to his boots. The light changed instantly. The dim, red-tinged darkness of the storm-battered hallway vanished. Room 305 was bathed in the golden, syrupy light of a late afternoon sun. George blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brilliance. The room was immaculate. The heavy velvet drapes were pulled back, revealing the large windows that looked out over the Gulf of Mexico. But it wasn't the angry black ocean of the present-day storm. The water was a calm, sparkling turquoise. The waves, gentle white ribbons rolling onto the sand. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. The furniture was wicker and bamboo, the cushions upholstered in a tropical floral print that screamed of the era. There was a small television set in the corner, a boxy thing with a dial, sitting silent. On the dresser, a half-empty bottle of Lone Star beer sat on a coaster, condensation still beating on the brown glass. Next to it was a pack of Marlboros and a set of car keys. And there, standing by the open window, with her back to him, was Norma. She was looking out at the ocean, her hands resting on the sill. The breeze from the window caught the hem of her blue dress, making it dance around her calves. The sunlight caught the loose strands of her hair, turning them into spun gold. She looked vibrant, solid, and undeniably real. George stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack them. He couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was filled with sand. He was an intruder in a painting, a ghost in his own memory. He was 71 years old, weather-beaten and weary, standing in the sanctuary of his 30-year-old life. "You stopped playing," Norma said. Her voice was light, musical, devoid of the rasp that age eventually brings. She didn't turn around yet. She kept watching the waves. I didn't think you could hear me," George managed to whisper. His voice sounded rough, intrusive in this pristine space. "I always hear you, George," she said, tracing a pattern on the windowsill with her finger. "Even when you're miles away, even when you're just thinking the melody in your head. That's how it works, isn't it? You play and I listen." She turned around. The impact of seeing her face was like a physical blow. She was young. Her skin was smooth, unblemished by the years of Texas sun. Her eyes were bright, filled with the mischievous spark that he remembered so vividly from their courtship. She didn't look at him with shock or horror. She didn't scream at the sight of an old man standing in her room. She looked at him with a deep, knowing smile, as if she were looking at a puzzle she had already solved. "You look tired, cowboy," she said softly. George dropped his guitar case. He didn't care about the instrument. He took a trembling step toward her. "Norma, is it really you?" "It's me," she said, stepping away from the window and moving toward him. Her movement was fluid, graceful. "Or at least, it's the me that belongs here, in this room, in this moment." "I don't understand," George said, tears finally spilling over his lashes, tracking through the deep lines of his cheeks. "I was in the hallway. It's 2023 out there. There's a storm. We're old, Norma. We're grandparents. I'm an old man." Norma stopped just a foot away from him. She reached out and took his hand. Her skin was warm, soft, and electric. The touch grounded him, stopping the spinning of the world. She looked down at his hand, the wrinkled skin, the liver spots, the thick knuckles of a man who had spent a lifetime gripping reins and fretboards. She traced the veins with her thumb. "Time is a funny thing in this hotel, George," she said quietly, "especially in this room. We were so happy here, weren't we, that week? We were so full of love that I think we stained the walls with it. We soaked the floorboards with it. Maybe love like that doesn't just go away when you check out. Maybe it stays here, waiting for you to come back and visit." George looked into her eyes. He saw his wife, not a memory, but the soul of the woman he had loved for half a century. "I missed you," he choked out. "I know you're back at the ranch, the real you, but I miss this. I miss the simplicity. I miss who I was when I was with you here." Norma smiled, a sad, sweet expression. "You carry the weight of the world now, don't you? I can see it in your shoulders. I can see it in the gray of your beard. You became the king, George. You did everything you said you were going to do." "It cost a lot," George whispered. "It cost time. It cost privacy. Peace. Everything costs something," Norma said. She gently pulled him toward the two wicker armchairs that sat facing the window. "Come sit. Put your feet up. You've been standing for 40 years. George let himself be led. He sank into the wicker chair, the frame creaking under his weight. The comfort was immediate and overwhelming. He felt the tension draining out of his neck, his back, his legs. Norma sat in the chair opposite him, crossing her legs, smoothing the blue dress over her knees. "Tell me," she said, leaning forward, her eyes searching his. "Tell me about the life we built, the parts I haven't lived yet in this room. Tell me about the good parts." George took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the room. He looked at his young wife, and he began to talk. He told her about the ranch growing. He told her about the horses they had raised, the champions and the stubborn mares. He told her about Bubba growing up, becoming a man, a father. He told her about the grandkids, describing their faces, their laughs, the way they rode their ponies. He spoke for what felt like hours. The sun outside the window dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but it never quite set. The room seemed suspended in an eternal golden hour. Norma listened intently, laughing at the funny stories, her eyes glistening at the sad ones. She didn't ask about the fame. She didn't ask about the #1 hits or the awards. She asked about the Sunday dinners. She asked about the Christmas mornings. She asked about the quiet nights on the porch. "We did good then?" she asked, after he had finished a story about a particularly chaotic Thanksgiving. "We did good." George nodded. "We made a life, Norma, a real life. Despite the madness of the business, we kept the main thing the main thing." "And you?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Are you happy, George?" George looked out at the perfect, calm ocean of 1982. He thought about the storm raging in the hallway of 2023. He thought about the loneliness that sometimes caught him in crowded rooms. "I'm grateful," he said carefully. "I'm blessed beyond measure. But I'm tired, Norma. I'm so tired of the noise. Sometimes I feel like I'm just a brand, a logo on a truck, not a man anymore. I came here looking for silence. I didn't know I was looking for you." Norma reached across the small gap between their chairs and took his hand again. "You never lost me, George. But you did lose a piece of yourself along the way. The piece that knew how to just be. The George who could sit in a room with a cheap beer and watch the waves without thinking about the next tour date." She squeezed his hand. "That's why the door opened. You didn't break in. You were invited. The room knew you needed to remember how to breathe." George looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and aged, hers smooth and young. The contrast was stark, but the connection was seamless. "I don't want to leave," he admitted, the confession hanging heavy in the air. "I want to stay here, in this light, with you." Norma shook her head slowly. "You can't stay, my love. This is a memory. It's a beautiful, perfect echo, but it's not life. Life is messy. Life is out there in the storm. Life is getting old. Life is the aches and the pains and the joy of seeing your grandkids grow. If you stay here, you become a ghost. And you're not done yet, George Strait. You have more songs to write. You have more trail to ride." "I don't know if I have the melody anymore," George said, his voice low. Norma stood up. She walked over to where he had left his guitar leaning against the wall. She picked it up and brought it to him. "You have the melody," she said firmly, placing the instrument in his lap. "You just forgot where it came from. It didn't come from Nashville. It didn't come from the radio. It came from us. It came from the love that breaks down doors and melts lead." She moved behind his chair and wrapped her arms around his neck, resting her chin on his shoulder, her cheek against his rough gray stubble. He could feel the warmth of her, the beat of her heart against his back. "Play it again," she whispered in his ear. "Play I Cross My Heart. But this time, don't play it to open the door. Play it to say goodbye to this room. Play it to take the peace with you." George lifted his hand to the guitar. His fingers found the familiar shapes. But this time, he didn't feel the desperation he had felt in the hallway. He felt a profound, settling calm. He felt the presence of his wife, the young version and the memory of the current version, merging into one force of support. He began to play. The acoustics of the room were warm and intimate. The sound bounced off the plaster walls and the glass of the window, wrapping around them like a blanket. "In all the world you'll never find a love as true as mine." As he sang, he felt the room begin to vibrate. The golden light outside the window started to pulse. The scent of the ocean grew stronger, then began to fade, replaced by the smell of ozone and rain. He kept his eyes closed, feeling Norma's arms around him, anchoring him as the world began to shift. He poured his gratitude into the song. He thanked the room. He thanked the past. He thanked the woman holding him for being his compass in a world that was constantly trying to spin him off course. He played the final bridge, the notes ringing out clear and true. "And if, along the way, we find a day it starts to storm?" He felt Norma's lips press a soft kiss to his cheek. "You've got the promise, George," she whispered, her voice beginning to sound distant, like a radio signal fading out. "You've got the ring, and you've got the song. Go back. The world needs the cowboy, but the cowboy needs to remember he's just a man. The light behind his eyelids turned from gold to red. The warmth on his back began to cool. The smell of coconut oil was overtaken by the smell of old dust and damp carpet. George kept playing until the last note died away. He opened his eyes. He was sitting in the hallway. He wasn't in the wicker chair. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the door of room 305. The hallway was dark, lit only by the emergency exit sign. The storm outside was raging with renewed fury, the wind howling like a banshee. The door behind him was closed. George scrambled to his knees and turned around. He ran his hand over the lock. It was cold. The lead seal was back. It was dull, gray, and scratched, looking as if it hadn't been touched in 10 years. The wood was solid, immovable. There was no light spilling from the crack, no sound of humming, no smell of perfume. Panic flared in his chest for a second. Had he dreamed it? Had he fallen asleep in the hallway and hallucinated the entire hour? Was it just the madness of a tired old man? He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting on the floor. He looked down at his guitar. It was dry, but his shirt was damp, not from the rain outside, but from the humidity of a tropical afternoon. He looked at the floor where he had been sitting. There was no Polaroid. The photo was gone. "No," he whispered. "It was real. I know it was real." He looked around the empty hallway, desperate for proof. He needed something. He couldn't walk away with just a feeling. The mind would eventually convince him it was a dream. He needed a token. And then he felt a weight on his left hand. He looked down. His hand was gripping the neck of the guitar. On his ring finger, sitting below his wedding band, was something that hadn't been there when he walked into the hotel. It was a heavy gold signet ring. George brought his hand up to his face, the red light of the exit sign glinting off the metal. He knew this ring. It was his father's ring. He had given it to Norma to hold in her beach bag during that trip in 1982 because it was loose and he was afraid of losing it in the ocean. She had lost it. They had searched the room, the sand, the car. It was gone. She had cried for days about it, blaming herself. He had told her it was just a ring, that it didn't matter. But it had always been a small, unresolved mystery of that trip. The ring was on his finger. It fit perfectly. It was warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun on a windowsill for 40 years. George stared at the ring, his breath catching in his throat. The room had returned what the time had stolen. It was the receipt, the proof of purchase for the sole transaction that had just occurred. He looked back at the door of room 305. He didn't try to open it again. He didn't knock. He placed his hand flat against the wood one last time, a gesture of reverence. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll tell her you said hello." He picked up his guitar case, latching it shut with a decisive click. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low. He felt different. The bone-deep weariness was gone. The spiritual exhaustion had evaporated. He felt light. He felt a melody humming in his chest, a new song, or perhaps the oldest song, renewed. He turned and began to walk toward the elevator. The hallway seemed less ominous now. The flickering lights didn't bother him. The storm outside was just weather, and he was a man who knew how to ride out a storm. As he pressed the button for the lobby, the elevator doors slid open immediately, as if they had been waiting for him. He stepped inside, and as the doors closed, shutting off the view of the third-floor corridor, George Strait smiled. He had checked in, looking for silence. He was checking out with a symphony. The elevator descended with a smooth hydraulic hum, a stark contrast to the mechanical groans that had accompanied George's ascent hours earlier. He watched the floor numbers light up in succession: 3, 2, L, each chime bringing him closer to the ground level, closer to the present day, closer to the reality that awaited him. But George Strait was not the same man who had entered those brass doors. He stood taller. The slump in his shoulders, born of decades of carrying the expectations of an entire genre of music, had vanished. His hand, resting on the railing, felt heavy. The gold signet ring, a tangible anchor to the miracle he had just lived. When the doors parted, the lobby of the Hotel Galvez was exactly as he had left it, yet entirely different. The storm was still raging outside, the wind battering the glass with a rhythmic ferocity, but inside, the shadows seemed less menacing. The night manager, the older man who had been paralyzed with fear on the third floor, was standing behind the marble front desk. He looked pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the elevators as if expecting a spectral entity to emerge. When he saw George, solid, dry, and calm, walk out, he let out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. George approached the desk, his boots clicking rhythmically on the polished floor. The sound was authoritative, grounded. He placed the heavy brass room key on the marble surface. It made a solid, definitive clunk. "Checking out already, Mr. Strait?" the manager asked, his voice trembling slightly. You didn't stay the night. It's barely 5 a.m." George tipped his hat back slightly, revealing eyes that held a profound, serene clarity. "I stayed long enough," George said softly. "I found what I was looking for." The manager looked at the key, then up at George, then hesitantly at the ceiling, toward the third floor. "And the hallway? The disturbance?" "It's quiet now," George assured him. "The door is closed. It won't open again. Not for a long time. You don't have to worry about room 305. It just needed someone to listen." George reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of cash. He peeled off several $100 bills and placed them on the counter next to the key. "This is for the trouble," George said, "and for the coffee, and for keeping a secret. What happens in the Galvez stays in the Galvez, right?" The manager nodded vigorously, taking the money with shaking hands. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. We never saw you. You were never here." "I was here," George corrected him, a small smile playing on his lips. "I was here more than I've been anywhere in 40 years." He turned and walked toward the revolving doors. He didn't look back at the chandeliers or the potted palms. He pushed through the glass and stepped out into the pre-dawn chaos. The rain was still falling, but the worst of the squall had passed, moving inland toward Houston. The air was thick and cool. George walked to his truck, the water soaking his shirt again, but this time he welcomed it. It was a baptism, a cleansing. He climbed into the cab, the smell of old leather and diesel greeting him like an old friend. He started the engine, turned on the wipers, and pulled out of the lot. The drive back to the ranch was a journey through the gray transition between night and day. As he crossed the causeway, leaving Galveston Island behind, the sky to the east began to bruise with purple and indigo. The Gulf was a churning mass of slate-gray water, but on the horizon, a thin line of gold was threatening to break through the clouds. George drove in silence for the first hour. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need to hear other people's songs. He had a melody looping in his head, a new one, born from the silence of the hotel room. It wasn't a song about cowboys or rodeos. It wasn't a song about drinking whiskey or losing women. It was a song about the elasticity of time. It was about how a single room can hold a lifetime of love, preserving it like a fly in amber, waiting for the heart to be ready to reclaim it. The lyrics formed in his mind with the rhythm of the tires on the wet asphalt. The wood remembers what the mind forgets. The walls hold on to the no regrets. I walked through the door of yesterday and found the love we stowed away. He tapped the steering wheel in time with the phantom beat. He knew he would record it. He would cut it with just a guitar and a cello, something haunting and sparse. It wouldn't be a radio hit. The label would probably hate it. They would want something upbeat, something for the honky-tonks. But George didn't care. He had reached a point where the art was no longer a commodity. It was a testimony. By the time he reached the gates of his ranch outside of San Antonio, the sun had fully risen. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world that was scrubbed clean. The wet grass of the pastures sparkled like millions of diamonds. The Texas live oaks dripped water onto the muddy drive. The cattle were already up, grazing in the mist that clung to the low ground. George parked the truck near the main house. He sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. He looked down at his hand. The signet ring was still there. It hadn't faded with the sunrise. It was heavy, gold, and real. He twisted it around his finger, feeling the engraving. He grabbed his guitar case and walked up the stone path to the house. The front door was unlocked. It was always unlocked for him. He stepped inside, the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon hitting him instantly. It was the smell of home. Norma was in the kitchen. She was standing by the stove, her back to him, flipping pancakes on a griddle. She was wearing a simple housecoat, her hair gray and cut short, her posture slightly stooped compared to the woman in the hotel room. She was 71 years old. She moved a little slower. Her hands, when she reached for the salt, showed the signs of arthritis. But to George, standing in the doorway, she was more beautiful than the vision in room 305, because this Norma had walked the long road with him. This Norma had endured the years. The woman in the hotel was a snapshot of potential. The woman in the kitchen was the realization of commitment. "You're back early," Norma said without turning around. She knew his footsteps. She knew the sound of his breathing. "I thought you were going to stay in Austin for a few days. Did the storm chase you home?" George set the guitar case down gently. "Something like that," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. Norma turned around, a spatula in her hand. She looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression softened. She saw the wet clothes, the exhaustion around his eyes, but she also saw the light. She saw the shift in his energy. "You look different," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Did something happen?" George walked over to the kitchen table and pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Norma. I need to tell you a story, and you're probably not going to believe it." Norma chuckled, a warm, raspy sound. "George Strait, I have been married to you for over 50 years. I have believed you when you said you'd be home for dinner and showed up 3 months later. I have believed you when you said a song about an ex-girlfriend in Fort Worth was fictional. Try me." She sat down opposite him, pushing a mug of black coffee toward him. George wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic. "I went to Galveston," he started. "I went to the Galvez." Norma's smile faltered slightly. A shadow of nostalgia crossed her face. "We haven't been there in years. Not since 82, George finished. "I checked in, or I tried to. I ended up on the 3rd floor, room 305. Norma's eyes widened. "That was our room, the one with the view." "It was sealed, Norma. They said it had been closed for 10 years due to flood damage, fused shut with lead. But I saw the light under the door. I heard you singing." Norma went very still. "Singing what?" "I Cross My Heart, the acoustic version, the porch version." George recounted the night. He spoke slowly, detailing the fear, the confusion, the Polaroid sliding under the door, and the moment the music unlocked the lock. He described the room, the sunlight, the smell of her old perfume, the blue dress. He told her about their conversation, about how the memory Norma had told him to stop being the king and remember to be the man." Norma listened in silence, tears pooling in her eyes but not falling. She didn't interrupt. She didn't call him crazy. She simply absorbed the tale, her hand covering her mouth as he described the feeling of her arms around him in the vision. "It sounds like a beautiful dream, George," she whispered when he finished. "A dream brought on by a tired heart. You've been running so hard for so long." "It wasn't a dream," George said firmly. "George?" "I have proof." George lifted his left hand from the coffee mug and placed it on the center of the table. The morning sun, streaming through the kitchen window, hit the gold signet ring, making it flare with brilliance. Norma gasped. The sound was sharp, sucked-in breath that took all the air out of the room. She stared at the ring. She reached out a trembling hand and touched it, running her finger over the crest. "My God," she whispered. "George, I lost this. I lost this 40 years ago. I remember crying in the car all the way back to San Antonio. I turned that room upside down. I checked the drains. It was gone. The ocean took it." "The room kept it," George said. "It kept it safe until I was ready to go back and get it." Norma looked up from the ring to his face. The tears were flowing freely now. This wasn't a story anymore. This was a physical impossibility sitting on her kitchen table. It was a breach in the fabric of reality, mended by love. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did it give it back now?" "Because I was ready to check out," George said, his voice steady. "Not of life, but of the noise. The room gave it back to remind me that the only things that matter are the things we carry with us. The fame, the money, the records, they stay in the lobby. But this," he tapped the ring, "this goes with us." Norma stood up and moved around the table. She didn't hug him like the young ghost in the hotel. She hugged him with the fierce, solid grip of a wife who has weathered every storm. George buried his face in her shoulder, smelling the soap and the flour and the reality of her. "I love you, Norma," he mumbled into her neck. "I love you more than the music. I love you more than the applause." "I know, George," she soothed him, stroking the back of his head. "I've always known, but it's good to hear you say it like you mean it again." The days that followed were quiet at the ranch. George didn't pick up the phone. He canceled a scheduled press tour for his upcoming album. He spent the mornings riding the fence line, checking the herd, feeling the sun on his back. He spent the evenings on the porch with Norma, watching the sun go down, twisting the ring on his finger. He did write the song. He sat in his small home studio, just him and his guitar, and he laid down the track in one take. He didn't use a click track. He didn't use auto-tune. He just played the melody that the room had given him. He called it The Key to 305. 6 months later, George Strait walked onto the stage at the NRG Stadium in Houston. The crowd of 70,000 people roared. A sound like a physical wave crashing against the stage. The lights were blinding. The energy was electric. It was the biggest rodeo show of the year. George wore his starch-pressed shirt and his black hat, looking every inch the king. But something was different. The band knew it. The crew knew it. Even the fans in the nosebleed seats could feel it. There was a stillness in him that hadn't been there before. He played the hits, Amarillo by Morning, The Chair, Troubadour. He gave them what they wanted. But near the end of the set, he signaled to the band to cut the sound. The stadium went quiet. 70,000 people hushed, waiting. George walked to the microphone, his acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. He adjusted the stand. "I want to do something a little different tonight," George said, his voice booming through the massive speakers, yet sounding intimate. "I want to play a song about time, about how fast it goes, and about how, if you're lucky, and if you're brave enough to knock on the right door, You get a second chance to appreciate what you have. He looked off to the side of the stage. Norma was standing there in the wings. She wasn't wearing a blue dress from 1982. She was wearing jeans and a blazer, watching him with a smile that anchored his soul. George looked down at his left hand. The camera zoomed in, projecting the image onto the massive jumbotron screens above the stage. The gold signet ring glinted under the spotlights. "This song is for my wife, Norma," George said, "and for anyone who thinks the best days are behind them. They ain't. They're just waiting for you to unlock them." He began to play. The melody of the key to 305 floated out over the stadium. It was simple. It was haunting. It was the sound of a man who had stared into the abyss of time and blinked. The ocean takes what it wants to keep, but love is a promise the water can't sweep. I found my heart in a room made of gold. A story of youth that never got old. As he sang, people in the crowd began to weep. They didn't know the story of the hotel. They didn't know about the lead seal or the ghost in the blue dress. But they knew the feeling. They knew the longing for a moment past. They knew the desire to go back and tell their younger selves that it was going to be okay. George Strait wasn't just singing a song. He was opening a door for them, inviting them all into room 305 for just 3 minutes. When the final chord rang out, there was no immediate applause. There was just a profound collective silence, a moment of shared reverence. And then the roar began. It started low and built until the stadium shook. George didn't bask in it. He didn't do a victory lap. He simply tipped his hat, a slow, gracious gesture. He turned and walked toward the wings, toward the darkness, toward Norma. He handed his guitar to a tech and took his wife's hand. They walked down the tunnel together, away from the noise, away from the lights. "You ready to go home?" Norma asked, squeezing his hand. George looked at the ring, then at her. "I'm already there, babe. I'm already there." They walked out into the cool Houston night, leaving the legend on the stage and taking the man home. The door to the past was closed, sealed tight with lead and time, but the light, that golden, warm, forgiving light, had come with them. And that was enough. And that was enough.